The transaction was complete, but the emotional cost weighed heavier than any legal fee. The deal was executed under the cold, clinical supervision of federal agents and high-powered legal counsel. This was not a swift, surgical act of justice. It was a grueling, agonizing process, a brutal, orchestrated transaction where Caleb Shaw traded his inheritance for his sister's fragile life. The setting was a downtown federal office, stripped of all personality, sterile and hostile. The recessed lighting hummed with a low, irritating frequency that seemed to amplify the silence. The air was dry and recycled, thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant and the anxiety of the high-ranking lawyers involved. For 3 continuous hours the only audible sounds were the scratching of expensive pens, the click of folder latches, and the low, tense whispers of the agents guarding the perimeter. Caleb sat at a massive mahogany table, his posture rigid, signing document after document that methodically dissolved a century of ruthless expansion. He signed away every deed, every share, every corporate charter, feeling the ancestral weight of every stroke, the cold press of history in the leather chair. He signed documents detailing the sale of Ironwood's most vital asset, the vast water rights, for $1 marking the true, symbolic, worthless price of the entire defunct empire. With that final signature, the entire Shaw operation, built on ambition and violence and territorial control, was officially extinct. When the last corporate file was closed, the final crucial documents were produced. These transferred the guardianship of Lila Shaw to a carefully selected board of medical trustees. Caleb spent a full 5 minutes staring at his sister's name, Eliza Grace Shaw, printed on the page, the only piece of the entire transaction that held any true value. This legal maneuver was the key to her survival, guaranteeing her immediate and anonymous transfer to a specialized neurotrauma hospital thousands of miles outside Ironwood's poisoned influence. This provided the necessary bulletproof legal cover for the high-risk evacuation that was about to take place. Across the hall, behind reinforced steel doors, Audrey Thorne, still in her defiant, custom-tailored orange jumpsuit, finalized her end of the bargain. She sat calmly across from Marshal Jake Riley, who recorded her statement meticulously. She described the location of Victor's hideout in agonizing, technical detail, allowing Riley to clock the precise time spent on the disclosure. She presented the single encrypted file containing the exact coordinates, security schematics, and all known escape routes of Victor Shaw's primary command center. This was an underground vault built into the ruins of an abandoned Cold War missile silo, known in Thorne records as Site Omega. He believes that silo is impenetrable, Audrey explained, her voice low, measured, and devoid of hesitation. He spent 8 months overseeing the addition of a reinforced concrete shell and a carbon steel composite blast door. He trusts only the geometry of the structure. She paused, letting her expertise sink in. But that silo was built on Thorne land and leased back to him 60 years ago. We know the original specifications. We know the precise pressure points, the vulnerable ventilation shafts. Their filtration systems can be targeted. The auxiliary power breakers, which can be overloaded externally, and the single exposed fiber optic line connecting him to the outside world, which runs through the drainage pipe near Sector C. This is not a guess, Marshal. This is a surgical guide. Riley looked at the coordinates, zooming in on the desolate, camouflaged structure on his screen. The weight of launching a federal assault was immense. The operational window is immediate. We go tonight. If this intelligence is compromised, if Victor has already moved, your deal is voided. Miss Thorne. Audrey watched Caleb leave the building moments later, escorted by two silent lawyers. He paused, his hand resting on the polished metal rail of the staircase, and looked back at her through the glass partition. It was a man stripped bare, owning nothing but the knowledge of the coming rescue. A heavy, silent acknowledgment passed between them, two bitter, broken rivals who had just committed the profound, unforgivable betrayal required to stop their father's cataclysmic war. Caleb knew he had less than 6 hours. The federal raid on the silo was a loud, unavoidable signal, a shockwave he needed to outrun. The moment the assault began, Victor would know he was betrayed, and his first desperate, vindictive move would be to target Lila's last known location, the Red Fork Canyon Hospital. There was no time to wait for the official, slow medical transfer. They had to move now. The medical evacuation was a ghost operation, coordinated entirely by the desperate Caleb. Using his most loyal remaining crew, Silas, his lifelong partner, and the veteran medic team, men whose fierce loyalty was to Lila's survival, not to Victor's defunct empire. Caleb supervised the careful transfer of Lila from the sterile underground facility into a specially modified transport vehicle. The vehicle was not a marked ambulance, which would be too obvious a target. It was an old, heavy-duty, armored industrial utility truck, disguised with faded generic maintenance logos and coated in canyon dust. The checklist was meticulous: ventilator battery life, oxygen reserves, anti-seizure medication doses. Caleb spent a desperate 20 minutes personally verifying every reading. He spoke to Doc, the lead medic, for another 10 minutes, reviewing emergency protocols for spinal shock in transit. "We have to go over the old logging trail," Caleb instructed Silas, his hands meticulously checking the tie-down securing Lila's life support systems. He traced the route on a worn topographic map, illuminating the barely visible trail with a penlight. "It's called the Widow's Peak Cutoff. It's rough, steep, and hasn't seen heavy traffic in a decade. It will tear the suspension, but it avoids every major road, every Syndicate surveillance checkpoint, and every federal route the Marshal might be watching. We lose a critical half-hour of transit time on the bumps, but we gain total, untraceable anonymity. We become invisible, Silas, for just long enough." The journey began immediately. It was agonizingly slow and brutal. The truck struggled on the near-vertical inclines of the unpaved trail, the engine roaring, threatening to seize up. Every rut, boulder, and sheer drop sent a sickening, violent jolt through the vehicle's frame. In the back, Doc, the medic, worked constantly, his brow furrowed, his entire focus on stabilizing Lila. He adjusted the 4 drips, checked the ventilator pressure, and kept his eyes glued to the vital sign monitors, which flickered nervously with every impact. The smallest fluctuation, the tiniest seizure, could mean failure and irreversible damage. Caleb, gripping the wheel until his knuckles were white, felt every vibration in his soul, the fate of his sister resting on his exhausted hands, and the resilience of a decade-old logging road that threatened to swallow them whole. As they began their slow, grueling ascent out of the final canyon backroads, a low, menacing thrumming sound began to fill the night sky above Ironwood. 3 dark shapes, Federal Black Hawk helicopters, flew low and fast without lights, their powerful engines vibrating the very canyon walls and shaking the dust from the utility truck. It was Riley's heavily armed strike force, converging silently on the missile silo. The raid had begun. Caleb pressed the gas pedal down, pushing the old truck to its mechanical limit. He knew the clock had just run out. Deep inside the abandoned missile silo, Victor Shaw was alone in his concrete-reinforced command center, entirely focused on his future plans for mayhem. He was jubilant, running a simulation of his next target. He felt secure in the impenetrable darkness of Site Omega, a king in his self-made tomb. He sat surrounded by banks of monitors, sipping a lukewarm coffee, savoring the silence. Then, at precisely 2 a.m., the lights on his primary satellite terminal changed color. They cycled from the reassuring green to a furious, strobing, retina-searing red. A single high-priority, critical, alert message, a sequence he thought was fail-safe, flashed across his screen, bypassing the silo's deep firewalls. It was from Seraphine's network, his last remaining true ally. Alert, high-probability kinetic threat inbound. Source: Federal. Coordinates: your location. Betrayal. Confirmed. Victor stared at the message, the coffee cup slipping from his numb fingers and shattering on the concrete floor. His euphoria collapsed into an icy, devastating rage. He roared, his scream echoing off the damp concrete walls. He didn't need to ask who. Audrey Thorne, the only person with the precise technical knowledge of his deepest defenses. He scrambled, his adrenaline spiking, for a backup plan, rushing for the emergency keypad. He heard the heavy thud-thud-thud of fast ropes hitting the silo roof access hatch directly above him, the sounds muffled, but terrifyingly real. The main air vents suddenly hissed, filling the entire corridor with a powerful, fast-acting sedative gas. Riley wasn't taking chances. The gas was piped directly through the ventilation system, precisely according to Audrey's schematics. Victor realized the depth of the betrayal. They didn't want him dead. They wanted him neutralized and silent. Victor, coughing uncontrollably, his lungs burning, stumbled back to his terminal. He fought the narcotic cloud, his vision blurring, trying to maintain focus. He managed to punch in a final, urgent code, a sequence designed to wipe out his entire financial and data infrastructure, an act of digital scorched earth. He strained, fighting the paralysis, his finger hovering over the final execution key. But before the final command could register, the heavily armored blast door at the end of the corridor was breached by a linear-shaped charge. The explosion was deafening, followed instantly by a blinding flashbang grenade exploding in the confined space. Marshal Riley, armored and helmeted, was the first man through the breach. He found Victor Shaw struggling weakly against the debilitating effects of the gas, slumping against a console, defeated, the light on his terminal blinking access denied. "Victor Shaw," Riley announced, his voice amplified by his helmet, cold and resolute. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and domestic terrorism. The war is over." Victor was roughly dragged out of the bunker and onto the chopper. As he was lifted high into the night sky, strapped down and fighting the blurring effects of the sedative, he looked down at the vast, dark canyonlands. In the distance he saw a faint, moving light, crawling slowly along the rugged logging trail. He understood instantly. the industrial truck. Caleb was not in Ironwood for power. Caleb had not betrayed him for a political victory against the Thornes. He had betrayed him for Lila. The cost of Victor's life and his empire was his sister's freedom. The next morning, Audrey Thorne was released from federal custody. Her initial charges were significantly reduced to minor regulatory infractions in exchange for her full cooperation and the critical intelligence that led to Victor's capture. She emerged from the courthouse in a tailored charcoal suit, shielded from the press by her waiting legal team, walking straight into a waiting armored car, a woman restored to power. The first thing she did was demand a final, private meeting with Caleb Shaw. The location was a borrowed, nondescript, furnished office in the city, the sole remaining unencumbered property Caleb still technically owned. Caleb was utterly exhausted, but he was grounded. He had just received word that Lila, now admitted under the name Eliza Gray, was stabilized and out of immediate danger, miles away in a city where no one knew her name or her history. The relief was a dull, persistent ache, the only feeling stronger than his loss. "It's over," Caleb stated, placing the last set of signed transfer documents, the final deed, to the office on the desk. He spoke as if delivering a eulogy for his family name. "The Syndicate owns Ironwood, lock, stock, and barrel. Victor is in federal custody, and Elias is awaiting trial. The feud is done. We fulfilled our end of the agreement." Audrey didn't look at the papers. She looked only at him, assessing the broken man across the table. "You gave up everything, Caleb. Your father, your legacy, your entire life's work. You fought like a gladiator, but you surrendered the empire. You could have tried to fight me for the land, to bleed me in litigation, but you chose your sister." "It was never about the land, Audrey," Caleb replied, pushing himself up to his full height, a ghost of the man who once fought for Ironwood. His voice was steady now. "It was about proving we weren't them. The feuding only ends when someone finally chooses life over power." Audrey paused, a rare flicker of respect crossing her features. "You have the guardianship back once the medical board releases her. You have Lila. You're free of this place. But you have nothing left to build on." She let the silence hang there, emphasizing the total nature of his sacrifice. She then slid a single signed contract across the desk, a massive, legitimate 5-year consultancy agreement. The salary and benefits detailed were staggering, designed to cover every possible expense, including perpetual high-level medical care for Lila. "You may have signed away the land, Caleb," she said, her voice dropping to a persuasive, dangerous tone. "But you didn't sign away the knowledge of how to make that land produce. You know the ground, the people, the infrastructure, and the rivals better than anyone. I need you to run the Ironwood operations, not as a Shaw rival, but as my chief operator. You will manage the territory that once was yours, working for the New Order." Caleb stared at the contract. It was a golden cage of chance to rebuild his fortune, guarantee Lila's endless medical expenses, but always under the banner of his family's greatest enemy, the ultimate indignity. "And if I refuse?" he asked, the final challenge hanging in the air. "Then you walk away with nothing, Caleb," Audrey said, her voice turning cold again, the true, ruthless Thorne nature reasserting itself. "And you watch from afar as I hire some incompetent outsider who will inevitably run your father's old operation poorly, eventually ruining the resource for everyone." And Should Lila's medical fund ever run low, I will use every legal avenue to come after it for every single cent owed in outstanding property taxes and legal fees. But if you accept, we establish a new order. You get your money and Lila's safety, and I get absolute, undisputed, and expertly managed power over Ironwood. We bury the past together. Caleb took the pen, the weight of the steel the only substantial thing left in his life. He looked at the name Audrey Thorne at the bottom of the signature line. He didn't sign for power or for vengeance, but for the flickering, anonymous heartbeat of his sister miles away. He signed the contract. The Shaw name was officially extinct in Ironwood, replaced by an operational subsidiary of the Thorne Syndicate. Marshal Jake Riley stood on the ruined foundations of the Ironwood Town Hall, watching the federal teams clear the debris. The Syndicate's leaders were in federal custody, the territory was stable, and the immediate threat was neutralized. His mission was complete, but he had a knowing suspicion that justice had been traded, not served. The Thorne family had absorbed the Shaw fortune and walked away with their power intact, solidified by federal authority. He looked at the paperwork, a corporate consolidation, not a criminal takedown. The true criminals were merely consolidating their assets under a new federally sanctioned management structure. Riley looked out at the vast, desolate canyonlands. The Shaw banner was gone, replaced by the deep blue and silver flag of the Thorne Syndicate, flying over the main mining operation. The dust had settled, but the power had only shifted hands. He knew that the truce between Caleb Shaw and Audrey Thorne was not born of peace, but of mutual necessity and an unspoken guarantee of mutual destruction if the agreement ever failed. The great feud was over, but the great silence had begun. Caleb, now the highest-paid operator of the lands he once owned, was a ghost in his own territory, working for the woman who had helped imprison his father. He was a survivor, not a conqueror, and he had finally understood the hard truth of the Ironwood Canyon. You don't escape the cycle. You simply change your role in its endless, bloody, and now silent history.